Rachel,
Yes.
we'll start with you, if you don't mind. And the question, imaginary lines are hidden today. What are some suggestions for dealing with this in today's environment?
Oh, the idea that they're hidden?
Yes. So the statement, it's a statement that imaginary lines are hidden today. Mm-hmm. So those arbitrary lines that you talked about, the presumption here is that they're not as readily apparent as perhaps they were.
Oh, as they were. Well, okay, so first I have to think about whether they're hidden or not. I think when a few of us met a few weeks ago, and I was speaking about Detroit, of course, Eminem's movie 8 Mile, made what's apparent to everyone in Detroit kind of apparent on a national level. And I remember my mother, who taught at a high school on 7 Mile, she's like, Eminem, just on 8 Mile, what's that? I don't know. I mean, it's not as if you could ever look at the promotional material for Chicago and see the north-south line drawn on a map, but of course it's not hidden for anyone who lives in the city or knows about that. I mean, I guess this is, in answering the question, I guess much of the way imaginary lines are maintained, it's partly, as Adam was saying, history reinforces them, but so does culture. I mean, it's just as easy as some parents saying, I don't want you going down there this weekend. I don't want you going out there, right? I don't want you being there, or, someone crossing in another direction, feeling a sense of surveillance or suspicion when he or she does cross it. So I guess back to the hidden, I guess we're not as honest as we once were about the lines, right? The language will say, oh, we're all together, we're all there, but the lines are very real and people live them and experience them. So to the usefulness of the question, or the hopeful usefulness of my answer, I think it really comes back to what Luis was saying. It's very, very powerful when people come together and talk about their experiences of those lines. In my own classroom, we were once having a discussion about public housing. I had a young woman who grew up in public housing and was raising her own family, dealing with trying to get Section 8 housing. And she spoke to the class. Everyone was giving their opinions about public housing, and she said, well, let me tell you, I grew up in public housing. I'm dealing with raising my own children and, with the Section 8 process, which is a very complicated one. I was once in the class, they're having an immigration debate, and one student spoke up and he said, I'm undocumented, and you know how I got here? He said, I picked the sport that takes the most endurance of cross country. Said, and I went to school every day, I went to my job in construction, and then I ran for as many hours as I could so that I could get a cross-country scholarship to come to UIC. So I guess back to the lines, we live them, right? We don't admit them all the time, and certainly if you're coming to a new city and buying property, the real estate person will never say it, but there'll be those little nods, where you should live or where you should be or where the schools are good, right? These things are quite coded, which is, I think, back to the hidden. So I think it's again, back to that notion of everyday life. It's about sometimes like freezing where we are and taking the time to ask people, how'd you get here? Where'd you come from, right? How's it going?
And wanting to hear the answer.
And wanting to hear the answer.
Yes. That's right.
Thank you. Yeah, and wanting to hear the answer. And instead of thinking, oh, I've got to jump and justify my own existence.
Right.
Yeah, really hearing that.
So with that in mind, and that was a great segue to the question for Luis, which is how do you begin to tell your story?
Wow. Well, I guess I have the benefit of being an author like you, so on some level you can't help yourself, right? You've got to tell these stories. And something I learned, which has been very interesting, the reason I always start telling people where I'm from and that we were from a dirt street and I had tuberculosis, is that there were some golden rules, which were don't ever tell anybody we're from Tijuana, don't ever tell anybody we were poor, do not ever tell anybody you had tuberculosis because it's shameful. Right? And I thought, well, first of all, it gives me street cred, so I'm Mr. Bad when people hear about that. Tijuana, whoa. But the other side of the issue is that those things that we thought were shameful are sources of immense power and authority later. And it seems to me that as bad as it could have been for you, that's a blessing because someone's coming up behind you that's had it worse and nothing will shake you. And it's better for the person who is coming that you went through something bad and you can help them. The other side of that is the good stuff. And I come from people who were put down and were, you know, called names. I myself was called names. I'm sure a lot of people in this room have been called names. I thought Mexico was awesome. I thought it was magic. Tortillas, baby. I was like, this was the holiest thing I ever saw in my life. I would go to the tortilla shop and look at the women making tortillas, and I was thinking, I was only 6, but I was kind of like, be mine, dusky vixen, you know, I will marry you. I thought I was going to marry one of those indigenous women, man, and eat tortillas forever. And then we moved to a little white suburb. We're the first mixed family in this little suburb of Hispanic mixture. And I was in 5th grade, and I went to the bathroom with my new homies, and I still talk in Tijuana. I have my Tijuana accent, you know, I was talking like a little vato. And we go in the bathroom, and I was with little ginger dude with freckles and my friend Leon Livingston from the Boy Scouts, all my pals. And they said to me, hey man, you're a greaser wetback. And they all started laughing. And I thought, ¿Qué? What? Yeah man, greaser wetback. And they all walked out. And I stood there in that bathroom, 5th grade kid, thinking I had grease on me. It suddenly was this horrible realization that grease was leaking out of my Mexican body and that white people could see it. Seriously. And I remember looking in the mirror trying to find the grease on my t-shirt, and I was frustrated. Where is the grease? So, and I got in trouble because I didn't come back to class. They came and got me out of the bathroom. Louis, what are you doing in here? You know what do you tell them? I'm looking for the grease. It doesn't make sense. But when you get home and you see that that has been applied to the people that you love the most in the world, then, and you have the gift to tell the story, then you got to tell the story. So most of it was telling their story, not my story. My family, the people I loved, my neighbors, who somebody thought was less than for some reason. Uncle who was brown so he couldn't swim in the public pool in Los Angeles. They wouldn't let him in the water. His lighter skinned relatives could. My dad looked like me. He was on the presidential staff of Mexico. Came to the United States on a tour, was in Texas. The president of Mexico was denied service in a restaurant because he was brown. They told my father, you're a white man, you can eat here. He can't. And he said, it's the president of Mexico. They said, we don't care who he is. The Mexican's not going to eat in here. Now you think about those things, and so you want to tell their stories. You want to be able, I have nothing to offer the world, I don't think, except art. I was blessed or cursed with that burning angel of art. It won't leave me alone. And so I have people who cannot tell their own stories, except amongst themselves, they'll tell them. So I grew up listening to the aunties tell these yarns and the grannies tell these yarns, and then they would come into, you know, if they came in here with you, they wouldn't know what to do. They would be quiet or probably start serving you coffee. Yeah. I come from the serving class. But those people are precious and holy to me. And, you know, to wrap it up, there's a wonderful Chicano novelist named Rudolfo Anaya. He's sort of a godfather to a lot of the American Latino authors, and he's quite old now and frail, but he once told me, you know, if you can take your little grandmother and through a story make her the grandmother of somebody in Iowa, you've done the most spiritual, political, romantic, and artistic religious gesture anybody could ever do. We've crossed all the barriers, and the only way you can do it is with art. So, you know, that's how I started telling the story. And part of the time I'm on the road just helping people do that, you know, trying to do workshops and writing things to do it.
Well, you're going to do a workshop here and after a couple more questions, because that's exactly what folks are asking. But before we do that, Adam, a great question. How do you create history in the moment? Which is almost like having the answer to knowing what the lottery is going to be next week, because you can figure that one out. Here.
Well, funny. That's a good segue because, I mean, in some ways, history is a lottery. You know, people do things. They try to tilt themselves against the conditions they see around them. They try to create these different sorts of combinations that didn't exist before. And then some get raised up by a very complicated, arbitrary, mysterious process, and some don't get known. And part of what keeps someone like myself in a job is that we get to go out and discover those stories that weren't told before and try to put them before people. And I think that's actually a positive humility to have about what it means to be about your work and try to have it realize a certain sort of significance, is that whether or not people appreciate it in the moment, I suppose also in your moment, is sometimes about factors that are way beyond your control. But you will not be able to get into that lottery without applying yourself or people collectively gathering together to apply themselves to do their best effort to do something that is of significance, that makes a difference, quote unquote. But I think, and this is where I think you can game the lottery, that appreciates the conditions that govern the moment that you live in. So again, I think that sense of broad vision means that you have to have a bit of a sense of what it is that's likely going to be the kinds of things that people are going to understand as constitutive of later moments. I played basketball when I was in college, and people speak about this as court sense. You know, being able to grasp the court and where people are, and to some degree where people are going to be later on. And so I think if one wants to maybe not make history, but do something that is going to move the needle of history, that has the chance to be reckoned as historically consequential, the effort, it seems to me, is key. And then the sense of what is going to be the shape of the board, not in your moment, but in the moment after, and moments after, and moments after, which in part, involves consulting what kind of shape the board was in moments before. I think doing that puts you in a position where you're able to speak to history, which I think is a different sort of way of saying that one makes history.
This one's for Rachel and Adam. How do you deal with beliefs that have been handed down by generations that impact common space given to us by the narratives and stories and histories that exist within our own families and communities? And how, I don't know where the question came from specifically, but how do you deal particularly when some of those beliefs are, again, seemingly antithetical to your own?
Carefully. In all seriousness, very, very carefully. And I mean, Rachel will have, I think, more to say about this because she's on the ground working with people who, empty out, in a certain sense, life possibilities because of their inability to work around those kinds of disputes and disjunctures. But too often, I think we treat that sort of interaction as an argument that simply needs to be won, and then it's over, and the person has an epiphany and transforms, and that's the end of it. And I mean, from Little Rock to Chicago, which is where I actually do most of my historical scholarship, to any number of different aspects of African American history, there's so many lessons that, as Faulkner said, the past is not, the past is not gone, it's not even over. That sense that one is always reliving those kinds of interactions, I mean, in a way, to draw from psychology, almost as a kind of moment of trauma. And those of us who know about psychology know that trauma is not something that just goes away. It actually has to be worked through carefully, honestly, rigorously, incessantly, I think, in order to be able to realize some kind of forward progress. And that is hard to do when people put enormous resources and enormous reservoirs of will to forgetting, either that they were traumatized, or that they have inflicted trauma on somebody else, or that something hangs in the balance in terms of the ways in which they live their everyday lives. But again, I mean, I think the best place to talk about this probably is the Middle East, because nowhere else are people sort of left with a sense of where does one go in relation to addressing that.
To start from the question, I was speaking to 4th through 6th grade class on Friday, and they had just seen a movie about the wall that separates, call it Israel from Palestine, as I think you heard. I think it's more complicated than that because, you know, these things spill over the lines and it's a much more complicated picture. One student raised his hand and he said, well, isn't that wall necessary to keep out the terrorists? And it was a young boy, and so you know where that comes from. That comes from the television in part, but it probably comes from the parents. And they might have reasons for saying that. You know, I don't know the parents' reasons. I really don't. But I said to him, you know, the thing about a wall is it becomes a lot easier to think that the people on the other side are monsters and aliens. And I put it in those terms, but of course, you know, we could bring that up to adult discourse, right? And think about how, you know, the idea that the terrorists are on the other side of the wall or the aliens are on the other side of the wall. You know, the wall makes those people who are in effect your neighbors, right? It makes those people into monsters and aliens. So that's what I said to that young man. And a lot of the research that I did do on borders in the area, I did some of it during the relatively stable period of the Oslo Peace Accords, some of it during the Second Intifada, some of it during the US invasion of Iraq, and some of it I actually did in American cities. Believe it or not, my Arabic really got good by spending a lot of time in liquor stores. Very talked about when I was in grad school in Berkeley because you have to kind of you have to log in a lot of hours to get a language, and a lot of my entree into Palestinian Jordanian families, it was because, you know, I met someone in San Francisco or Chicago. Then they would invite me, my family, to their home. And then I would have the number of the families in Ramallah, in Amman, in Bethlehem, and I would go. So, you know, often what I heard is exactly that question, right? Where the beliefs that you receive from your relatives, from your parents, from your ancestors, I mean, those are things we hold on to. And, you know, I'm not outside of this. I got wonderful things and great stories from my own grandparents, but there were also some, you know, some things that I wouldn't say out loud. It doesn't mean I love my grandparents any less. I mean, I really did, and that shaped me. But there's, you know, some of it I want to take, and some of it I would think, I can't believe from your historical experience that you would ever say that about another group of people. Like, remember being immigrants, right? Remember showing up and being the hated group. So it would always surprise me. Like a little bit of success, people will, you know, often led into to some horrible, thing. You know, it's like just like a little step up, and sometimes these things will come out. But that's family, right? And those are things that on the one hand we all hash out with our families, right? We have to respect our elders and our ancestors, but we also have to hash it out with our families, and we have to participate in that as well. But so here's the question, right? In working with people, in interviewing people, in dealing with conflicts in our own workplaces, we're left with a lot of that. And these are people's beliefs that they've heard from their parents, from their grandparents, from people whom they respect. So what do you do with it? Because first of all, back to what you said before, you have to listen to it. I mean, first of all, in a way, you have to hear it out. You have to hear what people are saying and why they're saying it. And this is, again, where I think everyday life can be very helpful, because then at a certain point, you know, whatever you're puppeting from what you've heard from family members or community members, then you've got to get up and you've got to do the job, and you've got to be successful, and you've got to share space and share resources. This, of course, has not yet happened in the Middle East, right? This is not what we're seeing. We're seeing these differences of opinion, you know, well armed and embattled. But it's, again, I mean, this is the new thought. I really think again and again that getting people in a shared region, looking at their water, looking at their energy, how much of it is there? What do we need to conserve? How do we need to plan? What do we need to share? I mean, I think it's a way that the minute you're actually dealing with your survival and your collective survival with another group of people, and you're working collaboratively, right? What your grandmother said, right? What your religious leader said, it might be there echoing, but there's a pressing matter that I think can bring people together. And you know, I know in my presentation this morning, although trained in religion as well as Middle Eastern studies, I didn't say much about religion, but here's another parallel. I also teach religion in a public urban university, and this is what I do. You know, I make everyone look around the room. I said, look around the room, everybody. Could we function here collectively if all of us were trying to convert the other one? I was like, just look around, everyone. And they look, and some of them nod right away, and some of them reluctantly nod, you know. And I say, look, I'm not here to convert you into anything, to convert you out of anything. I want to study with you, and I want to be in dialogue with you, and I want all of you to be in dialogue with each other. But we've got to commit to the shared space. I said, you know, I said, you know, come Friday, Saturday, Sunday, you know, you can believe about these things what you believe, and that's important to you. I'm not devaluing that in any way. But we've got to build a space here of dialogue. And we've got, you know, we have to check that. We have to check the thing that what I know is truth, or what I know is better, or I need to change you. Because you're not always going to change. You can't really change people's core beliefs. But you can make a space and have a project and have a goal where those things, you know, are not helpful. So they're for another space and not the shared one.
Em, you wanted to add something else?
Just something really quickly. I mean, I'm struck as hearing and thinking about what each of us are saying and thinking about the work that you do, that I think all of us strive in different sorts of ways to create spaces that are egalitarian to some degree, in which reciprocal exchange could take place. Companies are not democracies. And so in a certain sense, what we're trying to talk about, there needs to be, I think, some translation in terms of thinking that through. But history is also not a democracy. I mean, one of the most famous things that's ever been said about history is that history is written by the victors. And yet, so much of what we're talking about are people that certainly were not poised to be victors at the point that they were making history, to go back to the question that was asked of me, or in some cases were regarded as victors after they had done what it was that they had done. And I think that's something that may be helpful in relation to just thinking about the spirit and the ethos and the urgency of your work, is that even in undemocratic spaces, even in hierarchical spaces, even in spaces that have a certain kind of structure of command, it's possible for history or the story or the pieces that are exchanged to be written by more than the voice in charge. And I think something very, very simple to pull out from some of this is the different sorts of ways to imagine making that translation, from stories that are official and sort of brought down to stories that are actually able to percolate up and inform a different perspective. And to some degree, I think much of what all of us are talking about is encouraging people to share those stories. Part of it is to bring, I think, a little bit more of a breadth of creation of the space of the company, as opposed to the space of the classroom or the space of the writing workshop or others that we're familiar with.
Yeah. You know, the great Nigerian novelist, Chimina Adichie, talked about the danger of a single story, of seeing someone else's narrative through a single lens. I was thinking about that when you were talking about the constituencies around Rustin, who tried to parse his life to fit their specific agenda, whether it was a political one, whether it was gay rights, trying to take that portion of his experience and reduce him just to that, even though he himself, you know, said, oh, well, I'm many more things than that. So, Louise, we certainly had questions for you, a number of them, but they all revolved around this very specific ask and request. So if you see everybody pick up their pens, it's because they want to know how, this is called the instruction manual.
Oh, yeah.
So yes, you know where this is going, right? So how does a swap story work? What's the technique? What's the timing? So if you were to, I'm going to do a little amendment to the question. So if you were to instruct us specifically, 3, 4, and you might switch this, of course, but how would you tell us to begin telling our story?
All right. So first of all, Chimamanda Adichie, a story swapper. Thank you very much.
Yes.
So I was
A
glad to
great
hear
one,
you
too.
quote her.
Yeah.
She's a fellow Aspenite. But the issue first off, I just want to throw out to you, because of this, it may be imagined. I'm thinking a lot about your imagined borders. I think a lot of structures are even imagined, but there's a real hierarchy involved here. So one of the issues then is a certain level of fear. When I work for a boss, I'm terrified because I have the poverty mind that any whim from God above is going to send me back out to Logan Heights, and I don't want to go. And so, you know, there's a real fear to share with you. And the humility involved in you sharing back with this person is overwhelming and makes them have a share in your vision. You'll make a convert, to use a religious term, in a way that you can't imagine. So initially, I think that one of the reasons it needs facilitators is to create the space in which one can share. And it can't be a gigantic group. It really can't. A group that's manageable in size, that's willing to spend 2 or 3 days together discussing sometimes topics that are even not directly about the story swapping, but so you can get a consensus of vision. What they do in the Aspen Institute is they discuss literature and democracy. And you study Plato, Cervantes, all this stuff, you know, and everybody's angry because they don't want to do homework. I'm grown up, I don't do homework. But, you know, they do these really disarming things to get people involved. So, you know, the thought of you having one of your rooms, people attended to who aren't used to being attended to, being given meal, coffee, polite, you know, you're an equal here. Safe zone, shame-free zone. You get some clarity of idea between the two of you, the three of you. Well, it has to be in twos, 2, 4, 12, 20. After discussion being led by people. And then you don't pick your mate. The facilitator who's been watching you picks your playmate. Because I would go right to him, be like, yo, writer, come on, let's talk about books. They don't want that. If I was lucky, they put me with Pat. I'd like that. So the person who is watching you and listening to you and taking giving close attention to who you are and what your interests are will tell you, okay, this is going to have Luis and Pat, go. You and you, go. And you've already been told how this is going to function, that you will go off in a comfortable spot, nobody listening to you. You sort of know each other because you've spent 2 days or 3 days talking. And you're given not a writing prompt, like we do in writing workshops, but a speaking prompt. So say, you know, the most...
What is that moment? Tell Luis.
The most memorable
When you sit together,
moment in your life
and
that
Pat tells me this thing.
in late night
And then I
hours
tell
when
Pat
you can't
my
sleep,
thing.
you go back to, what is that moment? Tell Luis about it. And you sit together, you have your little vino, and Pat tells me this thing. And then I tell Pat my thing. This moment in my life I'll never forget. Say my Mexican godmother, who always wore her hair in a bun, and one day I stumbled into the bathroom and she'd let it down. And it was a gigantic curtain of hair to her waist that I had never seen. And I suddenly knew a secret about her, that she was a power woman. She was a conjure woman. She was an hechicera. She was a mythic creature, not just my little godmother. So we share it, right? It's really cool. Everybody breaks, has coffee, eats lunch, whatever. Pat's allowed to come to me and say, by the way, what did you say? What was her name? You know, little details, but you can't retell the story. And then we gather in a circle, satiated and relaxed, and then Pat has to be me. And she says, I was a young Mexican boy, and tells this story. Now, what's really interesting is she owns me. She owns my life. And it's going to come out through her filter. You have to you can't stop her, say, now Pat, that did not happen. Nobody said y'all or whatever, you know, the details that will change. It's her version. But you'll suddenly find, especially in the vertical structure, that when the person that you are answering to with great care and love hands your story back, it's devastating. And when the power guy, you know, we had Mayor Emmanuel in here with, you know, somebody from our cafeteria at UIC, and he sees his story handled with dignity and respect. Both of the participants are both elevated and floored at the same time. But I've got to tell you that the alchemy of it, the people in the room know right away what's going on, feel the care that happens, and there's never a dry eye, man. Everybody just loses it. Because we were all authors, by the end of the evening, people were begging, please somebody tell a story about your puppy, or, you know, stop killing us, because every story was like this incredible, you know.
Then you get Marley and me, you know.
Yeah, right, exactly. And that's how it works. You have to have a coach just to make sure. People think, well, I'm going to just jump in and do it, which you could do. The danger is putting on a show. And I will tell you, I mean, you know, we talk about history and the processes of history. It is a process that has evolved through trial and error, and there were some real errors. You know, there was a moment when they felt that they should go down to Denver and get some disaffected black youth and bring them up there and do it. What they did was they put these children together to do story swap, and then to do story swap on a stage in front of all the wealthy Aspenites. Oh, isn't that interesting? Those African-American children, lovely. And it was a terrible mistake. This was not about reveal your pain to us, because that's what we've always done. Get up there and sing for me. Oh, that's lovely. So it's participatory. You have the responsibility for this. It gives you the profound responsibility for the story and the preciousness and the soul of the person with you. So the facilitators make a space, a sacred space, I hate to say it, not religious, but a sacred space where it's safe, you know, to be you and to tell your story. And what comes out after that is an amazing thing to see, because it affects esprit de corps, you know, it affects momentum. It affects a kind of a dedication and a community sense that is incredible to me. I just had the great, great honor, I was telling some people in the break, to go talk about this at Hallmark Cards. Hallmark, what a great corporation anyway, man. But, you know, I told them, I can't believe I'm in a place where a corporation is dedicated to just doing neat stuff. What a great place to work, right? But they are always looking for new ways, obviously, to communicate internally as well as to the world. And so that's how you would do it.
For a lot of our organizations, we have resource groups that are aligned oftentimes around race, gender, or societal cause, veterans, African Americans, Latinos, women, interfaith groups as well. And hearing you describe that, you could almost envision, because there is a fair amount, I think we commonly say there's a fair amount of siloing, that the groups exist. So, you know, Black History Month, and the African American group says, well, here's what we're going to do, and then Hispanic Heritage Month, here's what we're going to do. And trying to break down those, you know, those experiential barriers can be a challenge. But I was just envisioning a session at any of our organizations where you now have to tell the other group's story, right, in the way that Louise has described.
And you know, what's really great too is, like I said, it was originally thought of as a kind of a lateral process, you know, between communities. But you can, you know, we've realized that within a corporation, you know, two divisions just talking to each other and saying, I didn't know that about you. You know, I didn't know that's what you guys do. I was seeing that at Hallmark Cards. They've opened this whole Latino division. They're trying to figure out, they have like Spanglish dictionaries. They're trying, and they've brought in Latinos who speak Spanish and English to write, you know, congratulations, mija, for your graduation from, you know, sexto grado. You know, it was hilarious. But again, the department that writes, you know, bereavement cards, they don't know what the Hispanic card room is doing. So now I think they're starting to think, you know, this is a way for us to all understand. It doesn't have to be Pedro from the San Isidro McDonald's comes and talks to the CEO. It can also be all, in every way, it's so flexible, depending on your vision and what you want to do with it.
Right, right. A question for peers, which is how, and we can all, any of us can answer this, but how do we reconcile the longer-term strategy with the need for short-term success?
Wow.
Yeah, exactly. So any of us can weigh in on that. Jim, you want to dive in?
You know, I think in just tying on what has already been said, I think you as a diversity leader have an opportunity to tell the story of where you're going and the story of the appropriate measures. So at any given point in time, your measure early on in the stories for most diversity practitioners has been about activity and maybe engagements, but it needs to evolve from that. So I think you can get some buy on time from leadership in terms of showing impact through measures and through the measure of activity. And then you've got to have in your mind, to the point that Adam made earlier, what's the bigger game, where are you going? How are you going to define it in year 2, year 3, and year 4? The measures have to go deeper. Someone at our table, Perry, mentioned kind of integration, so how are you going to integrate with other partners? But while you're showing measures of activity, let's say in year 1, you're already working in year 3 with partners to integrate into compensation, benefits, org development, training, wherever it may be. Just a thought, so for some others.
That's brilliant.
I would say probably the most obvious thing, and maybe it's not, is to recognize and have the organization recognize that it's no longer linear. So, you know, you think of the head, hand, and heart, that's not linear anymore. You think of getting the executive committee, and they know the business case is not linear, and one, is not sustainable. So one of the things that's in my mind now about the next stage of this, and you've helped with context, is something that is old and new in its privilege, but having privileged people understand their privileged problems versus having privileged people understand unprivileged problems in a sustainable way, because those things continue to happen. Because when you put it in a moment and now, it's right now, what are we going to fix? Versus my CEO's problems are long-term running the business. So that's one of the things that he's helped a lot with the Alliance context for that.
Just from what we said, I really have to say, from my perspective, the next phase has got to be integrating diversity and inclusion into the business model. The biggest thing one sees is the silos of departments and functionality. And the company exists to make a profit. And so we have to go to where the company's sweet spot is. And if we can integrate what we're doing with diversity with making a difference in the scorecards of our organizations. And you know, we did this in the real estate world, supporting business objectives. That's what diversity does. If we can take the story and change it from being so focused just on the individuals and the seat to the company's goal and reason for being, and making every person in the organization feel that they have a part in that story. Yeah. That's what I'd love to see the next focus of diversity and inclusion be. True inclusion. Everybody in this building belongs to the story of whatever our goals is. Is it selling a hamburger? What do you do in this department that helps this other department? Not just, then we'll get to creating our common story that you were talking about, Rachel. How do we bring people together for that? That's what I'd love to see us focus on.
Keith, could I ask a follow-up question to the group, which is that operation an operation of appreciating the potential for profit, positive growth, or is it also an operation of appreciation and assessing potential liability, negative growth? So in the sense, something happens in a company that's seen to be antithetical to the values of diversity. Maybe that creates a scandal that has to be managed through extra expenditures into public relations or damage control. Maybe momentarily you lose a share of the youth market because the youth market is much more oriented towards understanding these as positive governing social values than perhaps older generations are. But I guess I'm just wondering strategically, in part yourself, but also in a sense in terms of thinking about those that you report to, is there a sense that this is not just a question about expanding the pie, but keeping it from spoiling?
Yeah, I mean, I think it began, the role of Chief Diversity Officer really began as a defensive reaction to questions of liability. That's where the title Chief Diversity Officer came from, with all due respect to all of us. So it came from this place of defensiveness, litigation, and now when you hear us talking about the business case, we're still trying to answer that question of relevance. So why are you relevant? As opposed to a cost center. And for the most part, our answer has been to continue to say that look, our chapter as practitioners here is to mainstream and further integrate the work of diversity into competitive advantage, less of that corrective action politic and more into, well, we exist for this reason. And yet at the same time, to your collective points, if we're still not attentive to the stories of the constituencies, then we will still ultimately wind up losing the number of marketing faux pas that come out of departments. You know, Parker pen won't leak in your pocket and embarrass you. Translate that into Spanish. Don't realize that the way to say embarrass in Spanish is not embarazar.
Not pregnant,
right?
yeah.
It's to impregnate, right? Those, yeah, exactly.
Quite a pen. That would have a different market, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, very different market. Every man was threatened when that tagline came out. I mean, it's just, so some of the narrative gets lost as well, because you have to be attentive to histories, communities, and cultures. Just my take. Rick?
No, I agree. It sounds like, and it seems like in most organizations, the legal piece or the risk avoidance piece,
we pretty much got that nailed as it relates to many of us who are government contractors, things of that nature, or who have embarked upon legal issues within the organization. I think the opportunity for us is to really understand how diversity and inclusion will increase, top line sales and therefore bottom line profits. And I think that is the challenge, moving from the qualitative, this is the right thing to do, it's a nice thing to do, to going where she mentioned and say, well, it is this great work, it is this great work and the opportunities that it presents that has brought us all together. How does your work connect to our business objectives? And I think therein lies the challenge. Even from the compliance perspective, in most organizations, the compliance department or the AAP department is different, reports to someone else other than the diversity leader, and those groups are usually opposing one another. And one has the quantitative metrics and so forth that would help with the qualitative side and driving the business, and that doesn't happen either. But it's a both-and proposition that I think we have to get our arms around.
No, that's very helpful.
Candy, and then I saw your hand raised.
I'm struggling. I think I probably fall halfway in between those who are sort of fairly new to this work and those who've been doing this work since it began. In the days where we were talking about risk, to the days that we are, where we began talking about integration, to the days that we do whatever it is that we do, which is not the same any place that you go. I think that one of the challenges, and actually one of the questions that I had, is what did you think our work was? Because I don't think we know what our work is. And it's not that we don't know what our work is in the sense of in general. I think in general, we have a common cause to try to ensure that people have a decent experience when they come to work for us, that they have a decent experience in their interactions with whatever our products and services are that we deliver. The context that it comes with is without a story. So as soon as you say D&I, there is a preconceived thought about what it is that you do. And sometimes that then becomes the barrier for you doing that which you're trying to do. So if that space isn't carved out wide enough from the beginning, you become narrowly focused on that which is the work of employing butts and seats versus the work of employing and ensuring that the people who have an experience with your organization, whether they're employed or receiving a product or service, and depending on how you came to be in this work, it even becomes limiting factor as to how they perceive you and what they perceive you as having the ability to do beyond that which you used to do, but yesterday you used to do that and today you do this.
Candy, everybody's head bobbed, they're gonna have their neck in violent agreement.
So I don't know what the answer is, but I think until we solve what it is that we want to be known for doing, we will continue to have conversations about that which is we do, right? So we've been talking about some of the stuff. So for what our responses are, this is not new. What you bring is new. But how do we connect what you do to what we do so that if we left here and somebody said, what is it that you do, that D&I people do, that there is an answer that has its unique story because of where we do it, but it's not so unique that if you hire me and you hire Steve and you hire Melissa, you're going to go in one direction and another direction, and it might not take the company in the same place. And in fact, this is the last thing I'm going to say, that it will reinvent itself depending on who you hire. Right? So you actually aren't moving forward. You actually are sort of spinning around in a little circle like a little hamster, right? And you really haven't necessarily moved forward because when you come, you're going to do your thing. Then I'm going to start over, and then I'm going to do my thing, and then somebody's going to replace me, and they're going to do their thing, and then we're going to be back here next year talking about what that thing is.
So can I ask you a question? Have you?
I have no passion for this stuff.
You're awesome. You're.
Well, it's, your passion betrays you. How's that?
I love that. But you know, I have you had a kind of a summit where the.
I think this is it.
Yeah, maybe this is the
summit.
But a place where you know go off just you, and you know set your agendas together and have. You know, the thing that surprised me about all these writers coming together through the Aspen thing was Lisa's genius of having a summit meeting with no bosses, no editors, no public, no paparazzi, nobody to observe, and come to an agreement of vision amongst ourselves first before we go back out into the world. Before we did, you know, this isn't even related to the story swap stuff, but just that we had this society we were trying to create that wanted to have a vision, and we were all over, you can imagine, you know, Israeli novelists and, you know, people from all over the place, and some writers were like, this is just a load of crap, man, I don't buy it, you know, writers from Ireland, Africa. Maybe, you know, maybe it's something that will call for a retreat. I hate to use the old, you know, we in education, there are all these retreats and departments go off to a motel somewhere and, you know, eat chicken cordon bleu. But you know, perhaps a summit.
There's something else, which is that groups often that want to establish an agenda have an annual meeting. Because in part, they have an understanding of themselves as a particular professional sector that need to get together, establish their standards, map out goals, exchange best practices. And that's hard. I mean, I can think of all sorts of reasons why that would be very hard for you to do, but perhaps even just in the case of a place like Chicago saying there's a need, because I think one of the most powerful things that I heard you just say was that each time a person moves on to a different line of work or to a different firm, the job is reinvented anew. And if that's happening, I mean, I'm an academic, so I know all about procrastinating and sort of false starts and so on and so forth. But in business language, if that's happening, that's an inefficiency. That's a profound inefficiency. And that seems to me, maybe even before you get to the piece about addressing top receipts, bottom line and such, just getting to that point, that it doesn't make sense for an organization that wants to make best use of its resources to continually go back to startup in relation to an important key position within it. Maybe that's a compelling argument, and I mean, I think you said it incredibly well, so.
We could keep going, clearly.
Can I add one quick
Yeah,
thing
you
just
get
to
the
combine
final word.
these two things you were saying? I mean, the last time I checked, like markets have gone micro, right? And so we have things like YouTube and Google and internet. I mean, so, again, which is the last time I noticed, is that you've got to be, to get any message across, and again, I don't know your specific messages, but you have to be addressing multiple audiences at once. And again, back to my investment in everyday life, you certainly are not going to be addressing those multiple audiences in the same way, right? I mean, it takes a kind of a simultaneous platform to think about who are you talking to. And it seems that certainly the way internet technology has gone, that, that seems to me, again, like a real moment of opportunity, because that's how the bottom line is now becoming manifest. It's not going to be an address everyone television commercial or one thing. It's about multiple audiences at the same time. And that, again, from outside of your work, seems to me like a key thing that you would bring to the company, which is, again, what did we think you did? Well, I thought, my sense of it is that is not only kind of protecting employees and thinking about them and opening those doors, which I imagine it's what you do, but also thinking about how do you address the world? Because, I mean, we all hear that markets are global. And again, it's not one identity out there. It's not one experience out there. So it seems it's about bringing different local experiences, not only to bear on how your workplace forms, but also how you address the world. And that seems to me like a really valuable job that no one can get rid of right now, because any campaign, any product, any initiative, it's got to speak to a lot of people simultaneously, and it's got to do that in a genuine way, right? It's not just I'm going to pose, I'm going to look this way for you guys and look this way for you guys, but you have to genuinely think, how are you addressing these different, local constituencies, these different publics, because they are different, and it seems like a great opportunity to bring in different talents, different ideas, different histories and perspectives.
So a conversation that will continue over lunch, I suspect, at least about to. I could not get to all of your questions, but we will have Rachel, Luis, and Adam, and a round of applause for them, please.